So hello, everybody. My name is Gene Hardy. I'm an assistant professor of media and information at Michigan State University. I'm very happy to be here virtually. I was planning on being there in Ottawa, but as Carl mentioned in his keynote yesterday, these passport issues sort of sneak up on us when we haven't really traveled that much for the past 2.5 to 3 years. And when I went to go think about my travel, it turns out my passport was screwed up. So I am stuck here on a farm in Michigan with 4 inches of fresh snow, instead of hanging out with all of you cool people in Ottawa. I'd like to thank the organizers for putting together such an incredible symposium. If you would have told baby graduate student Gene in 2014 that he'd be speaking on a panel like this in the future, he would have definitely called bullshit. So the title of my talk is Rural Expertise and the Sewer. In April of 2019, I sat down with the city manager of Houghton, Michigan to discuss ongoing economic development work in the city and the surrounding region. The offices of the city are located in the gorgeous red sandstone building pictured here. Built in 1905 out of locally extracted Jacobsville sandstone, a type of sandstone only found in this area of the world, the building was originally a Masonic temple but was taken over by the city in 1989. Mining was the primary industry of Houghton and the surrounding region for over 100 years, from approximately 1850 to the 1960s, with the region being home to the largest deposit of native copper in the world. But this is not the case today. In fact, the last copper mine closed in 1968, the same year that the city manager of Houghton was born, in a small mining town about 20 miles north of Houghton. Encouraged by his family to get a degree and get out of the dying mining town he grew up in, the city manager moved south to Houghton, got an engineering degree, and worked as a civil engineer before starting work in the local government. A few years prior to our interview, the city received a $500,000 grant from the state of Michigan. This was an exciting opportunity for the civil engineer turned local official. The grant was meant to help high poverty rural communities to develop asset management plans for their stormwater and sewer systems. This program was meant to help communities like Houghton to develop new digital systems like these on the screen using video equipment and GIS to survey the quality and health of sewer and wastewater infrastructure. In the process, this was supposed to promote equitable access to new digital tools for infrastructure maintenance. Yet by the time of our interview in April 2019, only 2 years after the project was completed, the digital system and the accompanying data had been created and already fallen out of use. So what happened? This state initiative had all the calling signs of a successful government program. Everyone that applied for the grant received it. There was no matching requirements from the applicant, and the grant was designed to promote equity in infrastructure development and maintenance. What I will demonstrate in my talk today is how in this specific instance, the deployment of new forms of digital data and their accompanying systems butted up against the local and rural expertise of the sewer. In particular, what I argue today is that embodied expertise in labor and work, especially with respect to scale and familiarity, is paramount to understanding the impact of rural civic tech interventions. The remainder of my talk is going to go a little bit like this. I'm going to provide some information about my field site, the Keweenaw. I'll dive into asset management and how that materializes in Michigan. I'll share examples from 2 rural towns where I encountered this failure of uptake of the expensive GIS systems. And lastly, I'll reflect on the embodied expertise in rural labor, and share what I think I want to do with this idea moving forward. So what I'm presenting today is just one piece of a broader project that seeks to understand the role of contemporary digital technology and data in development discourse and development practice, particularly those that advocate for rural opportunity and inclusion in digital futures. To understand this, I've been conducting ethnographic research in a rural region of Michigan called the Upper Peninsula, pictured here, since 2014. Most recently, I spent 18 months in 2018 and 2019 living and researching in this particular region called the Keweenaw. I interviewed economic developers, municipal leaders, local entrepreneurs. I embedded myself in the operations of 2 different economic development organizations, serving some of the most remote and low-income communities in the region. And what I present today is primarily derived from this data. I draw inspiration and situate myself with an STS scholarship on the historical place of technology in American rural development, as well as the rural sociological tradition that investigates uneven development and opportunity in rural regions. I also find inspiration in the work of critical computing scholars, investigating the relationships between rural people, traditions, industries, and the design of digital systems, such as Stoop, Dombrowski, and Sue's work on data-driven farming, Norman Sue's work on learning from hunters to reconsider the role of nature and design, and as we just heard, Phoebe Sanger's extensive work on time and datafication of rural traditions and industries in the North Atlantic. So this talk is about asset management. So what the heck is asset management? It kind of has a couple of different meanings related to infrastructure as well as financial assets, but we're not going to talk about financial assets today per se. Asset management here deals explicitly with the management of infrastructural assets such as roads, sewers, and power lines that are public forms of infrastructure in which a government body has made a long-term investment. As Kagel states, asset management is embodied in knowing the following about the infrastructure. What do you have? What condition it is in? And what is the financial burden to maintain it at a targeted condition? Through this process of asset management, infrastructure is evaluated on these types of measures, and data is collected, mapped, preserved, and maintained on geographic information systems, or GIS. It's also done preferably in a way that standardizes the data across systems and allows for interoperability among regional, state, and federal bodies. So asset management in Michigan, Michigan has utilized asset management to track transportation infrastructure owned by the state since 1997. Its sewer and wastewater asset management program, SAW, was started in 2013. Unlike its transportation asset management program, which focused on infrastructure that was owned by the state, the SAW program focused on developing asset management programs across the hundreds of municipal and sewer and wastewater systems in Michigan. While the larger cities in Michigan by 2013 had existing asset management programs for their water infrastructure, rural communities and low-resource small cities did not. So the state of Michigan allocated $450 million, and cities, counties, townships, and publicly owned utility companies throughout the state were encouraged to apply. The state distributed 6 rounds of support through 2020. All of the entities in my field state that were eligible and applied winded up receiving funding. The overall goal of the SAW grants was to modernize the maintenance of public infrastructure through the creation and central interoperable storage of digital data about sewer and wastewater infrastructure. In one ideal case from the blog of Esri, which is the corporation who owns and maintains the GIS products that are used to visualize the data, such as the main one being ArcGIS. In this blog post, Esri talked about a township that was able to use its SAW grant money to digitize its wastewater network so it could streamline maintenance and help it respond to potential emergencies. The blog says that, quote, the new asset management system moved this town from outdated manual processes to modern automated workflows. The post continued sharing that township staff now have a mobile app that the team uses to more closely monitor its water system and provide contextual data when things go wrong. An important thing to note is that the SAW grant program gave municipalities the funds to develop these systems, but not to actually fix any of the problems that were found when the systems were introduced. So by the time I spoke to city leaders in my field site, particularly in Houghton mentioned earlier, and neighboring Hancock in early 2019, both cities had completed their grants and submitted their final reports to the state. The city of Houghton used the SAW grant to compile an inventory of all sewer system assets, develop its asset management plan, and develop GIS for tracking the data. Through this process, the city found out that nearly a third of its sewer and wastewater infrastructure was considered in poor condition and was now on the hook to spend $8 million over the next 20 years to fix it. The city of Hancock conducted a similar process and found that 46% of its main sewer lines were in poor condition and were now on the hook for $10 million to fix it. So in other words, both cities found significant issues with their sewer and wastewater system, and both would need to borrow heavily to resolve the issues. When I spoke to city leaders in Houghton and Hancock, I heard a much different story than the optimistic one that was described on Esri's blog that I just talked about, in which sort of the integration of this new mapping technology into day-to-day work was relatively simple. As we all know, none of these processes are actually simple, right? So both city leaders told me that the adoption of GIS was actually driven more by the needs of the engineering firms that they contracted with than it was by the needs of their employees in the Department of Public Works or their DPW. And these employees were the ones that were maintaining the sewers and the wastewater systems. As one of these city leaders said, quote, "The value of GIS is oftentimes more for the engineers and not for the municipal DPW crew. My DPW crew is one main water person and one main sewer person, and they know the system. They don't need to look it up." In other words, the GIS was a way of codifying tacit knowledge for contracted engineers that already existed in the employees at the DPW. In the case of these neighboring small rural cities with a combined population of only 12,000 people, the infrastructure that existed was small enough and their employees familiar enough that the new asset management systems were seen as essentially useless. As one of them told me, the laptop with the data and the GIS system was sitting in a filing cabinet down the hall from his office. A city leader from Hancock explained to me how he perceived the potential of asset management technology and GIS. He said it would, quote, would solve, be the cure-all for efficiency and quick access to hydrants and valves. He said that in the way it was portrayed by the state that if you have a water leak, you could immediately get the guys called out and he could, based on his laptop, go right to the water break and shut it off. However, he continued, it's not as practical as operationalized. Rather, he explained a complex process and said that it might be possible to identify the location of the breaks quicker, but that the work of the DPW employees would not actually get completed any quicker. Instead, the familiarity the employees already had with their small sewer and wastewater infrastructure most of the time already gave them the tacit knowledge they needed to quickly identify where issues would occur. In his words, quote, "It gives more data, but it doesn't necessarily make things quicker." While Houghton and Hancock were actually the most well-resourced municipalities in my field site with respect to budgets and tax base, they were only able to build out their asset management systems because of the SAW program and guidance from their contracted engineering firms. Despite the promised potential for transforming how municipalities maintain and track infrastructure, the systems were not used as intended. Instead, the SAW data sat on laptops that had been purchased as part of the grants, only to be used and updated by the engineering firms as part of their contract work. One major outcome of the state's SAW program should have been a democratization of digital infrastructure data access and use. But what we see here is that it doesn't matter if communities have access to the data if they don't have the funds or needs to utilize it. Instead, as I have demonstrated, they fall back on the embodied expertise of their employees, their knowledge of these small sewer systems to continue their work. As I and many others have argued extensively, information and communication technologies are designed for particular scales of intervention. In the case of privately owned social technology companies, scale is required for extraction of capital and creation of profit. The promises of technology itself as a scaling mechanism that allows bureaucrats to see infrastructure at scale through digital systems is part of obviously what makes it so desirable, as the city manager said. But the promise of scaling breaks down in these cases when small scale, largely rural infrastructure is the site of intervention. If I could be so bold as to suggest a causal argument here, I would suggest that the failure to consider the existing infrastructural expertise of the sewer and wastewater workers is sort of the cause here. It's this lack of consideration of the embodied expertise of the everyday rural worker in favor of the primary needs of expensive engineering firms in the state that led the failure and uptake of these systems. But I'm not anti-technological. In fact, I think that there are many unique opportunities for rural communities to use digital data and civic tech efforts in combination with embodied community expertise to combat some of the biggest issues that are facing rural communities today. But as I hope I've demonstrated in this talk, it's not enough just to fund rural communities with existing digital interventions. Instead, we need to design and implement systems with multiple types, scales, and relationships to data in mind. Moving forward, I hope to scale my own research to investigate the embodied expertise tied to rural places and experience, particularly how embodied expertise of place and labor can be better supported in the design of technical artifacts, supporting these workers laboring in primarily rural industries. So if this is of interest to you, I'd be happy to talk to folks about it. And I look forward to whatever questions come our way at the end of this panel. Thank you.